Oh, you're freezing up a little bit.
Okay, yeah. Sometimes it has a little bit of a snag. Okay. Good morning out there. Welcome again to the Pineland Speaker Series. We're very fortunate to have back with us again John Volpa. John is a former teacher, and he is currently the Director of Education for Pinelands Adventures. And today, John is going to talk with us about the legendary still family of the pines. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to John and look forward to learning some more about Dr. Still and his brother. Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you, Joel, and good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well and remains healthy. Today, I'm wearing my Black Run Preserve t-shirt. So I'm going to do a little plug for the Friends of the Black Run Preserve. We are sponsoring a middle school art contest, which will focus on people of the pines. It's called People of the Pines, People of Peace. And some of the historical figures that you're going to be introduced to today are a part of that story, as were some in the last presentation from John McPhee. So we're really trying to celebrate the unique cultural heritage, not only of Evesham Township, but of West Jersey and the Delaware River Valley. So if you'd like to learn more, you can go to www.blackrun.org. You can sign up for our latest newsletter, and there's an article in there about the art contest and other details about the Black Run and the Friends. So today's overview will also include a focus upon specific Pine Barrens plants that were used in traditional herbalist medicine and possibly used by Dr. Still, known as the Black Doctor of the Pines. And that'll be at the end of the program. But our main focus today is upon an African-American family that began living in New Jersey in 1805 as free people. Now that's 58 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. This means that we must begin our story earlier in order to understand how they could live free, again, something unique to West New Jersey. So let's go back to pre-European. Before the Europeans show up, the Lenape controlled a vast area, as you can see in the map, all of New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, into New York, up the Hudson River Valley, all the way to what is now Lewis, Delaware, along the Delaware River Valley. Their land was called Lenape Hawking for this whole area. And we're going to focus on the Delaware Valley region. And there's the name of the Delaware River as written in Lenape. They were peaceful people. They were a matriarchal tribe. And they maintained control of their area of, particularly in West Jersey, until the 1680s and beyond in many ways. So in 1638, as you can see, the Swedes and the Finns arrive. The King of Sweden wanted to get a piece of the action. Now, the Dutch had claimed this area, so the Swedes were kind of like putting a foothold in North America in an area that the Dutch claimed in 1609 when Henry Hudson came cruising by. So the Swedes get along incredibly well with the Lenape. And you can see the bullet points there in how well they got along, to the point that there was even intermarriage. Now, the Dutch, on the other hand, completely different story. Now, the Dutch essentially focused their settlements in what we consider today to be North Jersey, New Amsterdam, which becomes New York, the Hudson River Valley, Long Island, Staten Island. They come in with a heavy attitude of, we're the civilized characters, and these people are savages. Well, they claim the land as their own. Supposedly, for $24, they purchase Manhattan. Well, The Lenape and most native points of view about land ownership was that no individual could own land. You simply shared it. And that when payments were made, it was more to share the land, not own it and say it was completely yours. Well, even though the Dutch are trading partners with the Lenape, they don't treat them as equals. And this is going to lead to 3 wars. The first war, the Pig War, the Dutch settlers bring pigs into the area, which are not native to North America. They don't pen them, they let them run loose, along with their cattle. This causes conflict. Well, the pigs are running loose in the woods. Native Americans are hunting in the woods. They see the pig, time for a pig roast back at the village. So while they're having pig roast, Dutch show up and say, dude, that's my pig you're eating. And the natives are going, that doesn't make any sense. How can you claim an animal in the woods as yours? So an immediate conflict of culture. Well, the Dutch figure, all right, we've made these guys angry. Let's attack them before they attack us. They do. They beat up on the natives, the Pig War. 10 years later, the Whiskey War. Dutch get some Native Americans drunk. Next day, show up with a piece of paper saying, oh, look, they signed away this land. And the rest of the tribe says, no, that doesn't work. These guys don't have that ability to do that. Dutch says, yep, we're doing it. They beat up on them. And in the process, during the first war, skipped over what is known as the Hoboken Massacre. Over 200 natives, men, women, children, butchered by the Dutch. Obviously, things didn't go well. We'll get to the Peachtree War in a little bit. So the North Jersey area has this heavy Dutch influence, and the Dutch also bring in slaves into the area 1626. In 1664, the English kicked the Dutch out. Basically, this happened because of the Peachtree War. The Dutch find out that the Swedes are down in the Delaware River Valley. So Peter Stuyvesant loads up his army and all his ships to go kick out the Swedes. They go down there and to the Delaware River Valley, and with very little trouble, they defeat the Swedes. There's very little battle. They just immediately give up, and now they claim that area as their own. Well, while they're away back in North Jersey area around New York, the Dutch have been planting orchard trees for many years, cherry, peach, apple, and a young Native American woman was plucking a peach from a colonist's tree, and he saw her doing this, and what could he do? But he had to shoot her dead. Well, bad timing, because the army was miles away in Delaware River Valley, and the natives returned with a major massacre, murdering, killing Dutch settlers up and down the Hudson River Valley into Long Island, Staten Island, and this really was payback, which weakened the Dutch, enabling the English to take over. It's divided into East and West Jersey. East is given to Lord Carteret, and West is given to Lord Berkeley. Neither man ever comes here. They just start selling off parts, and West gets settled and sold to Quakers. John Fenwick's colony is the first one of Quakers in the area. Again, they interact incredibly well with the Native Americans, the Lenape, and they establish fair land deals that do not relinquish hunting or fishing rights and allow movement across property. Notice also that there were intermarriages between the English and the Lenape. So this signals the recognition of the natives as human beings, not savages or heathens, as was often the case between European settlers and the native people. The first ship of English Quakers arrives in Evesham Township. The Kent arrives in 1677. And a few years later, 82, Penn comes to what will become Pennsylvania. And these are some of the guarantees. And this picture is of a wampum belt that the Lenni Lenape gave the Quakers. Now, this just didn't automatically happen, this positive set of interrelationships. The Swedes and the Finns acted as emissaries for William Penn. They laid the groundwork. They already had a positive relationship with the Lenni Lenape. They laid the groundwork for the Quakers, saying, okay, these other characters are coming over from England. They're cool. They're going to be fair. They're going to treat you as we have. And so that's exactly what happened. And most people know this characterization, but it shows William Penn founding Philadelphia and meeting with the Lenni Lenape, giving them gifts and allowing them to establish Philadelphia and beyond. So essentially, the Quakers developed another culture of mutual respect, building upon what the Swedes and the Finns have done. Unfortunately, smallpox comes with them. It's believed that 90% of the native population is decimated. This really destroys their culture, and it becomes basically impossible to maintain control as they had for 80 years or so. Akanikin, who some of you may know, Camp Akanikin, YMCA camp in the Pines now, was one of those negotiators. And there was never any war in the Pine Barrens between the English and the Lenni Lenape. Now, Quakers, some of them owned slaves. Many of them owned slaves. They were about business. They were about making money. And this was an opportunity to make money if you could get free labor. William Penn owned slaves. And slaves were being captured in West Africa and being taken directly from West Africa to the Camden ferries, Cooper Ferry, etc. And if you go to Camden, there are historical markers explaining that this is what was going on. I mean, it was certainly not plantation type slavery. The economy was different. Many slaves became tradespeople, but slavery. So Cooper's Ferry, owned by Marmaduke Cooper. He had many slaves working his 400-acre fruit farms in Burlington County. Well, within 50 years, okay, I jumped ahead. So as you can see, many Quakers are buying and selling slaves. And within 50 years, this man, Benjamin Lay, a Quaker, begins to speak out heavily against slavery. He sees it as hypocrisy. How can these Quakers, who are such Christian people, accept owning another human being? And there are going to be two people who speak out against slavery. We're going to draw a distinct contrast in their style. So first is Benjamin Lay. Next, we'll speak of John Woolman, who was introduced in the last program. So a little bit about Benjamin Lay. We know he was probably a dwarf, maybe with a hunchback, lived in a cave outside of Philadelphia. We have this portrait because he was a friend of Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin commissioned this portrait of Benjamin Lay. Now, he gets well known for something he does at the annual Quakers Friends meeting in 1738. Now, he had been speaking against slavery for many years. And the way he did that was he got in your face, yelled at you, told you that you were not living by God's rules. He really made people incredibly uncomfortable. Well, to make his point one day, it's the annual meeting. He goes, he's dressed in, he's got a heavy coat, and under his heavy coat, he has a sword. And he has a book which many people, he leads people to believe it's a Bible. Perhaps it's a Bible, probably not. But he's hollowed out the pages inside, and he's filled a bladder with pokeberry juice. Now, if you know pokeberry, grows on the edges of the pines, bright red juice, looks like blood. Fills it in the bladder, puts it in the book, has the book with him. So he, the Quakers, there is no formal minister. People basically get up in the congregation to speak as the Spirit moves them. So Lay waits his turn. And finally, he rose to address this meeting of weighty Quakers, quote unquote. So many people were in this audience, in this congregation, were incredibly rich on Atlantic commerce and owning human property. And to them, he announced that God Almighty believed that all people should be treated equally, rich, poor, men, women, white, black alike. And he said that slave keeping was the greatest sin in the world, and asked, how could people profess to understand the golden rule if they owned slaves? That this was just an abomination against their faith. At this point, he throws off his cloak and he starts pointing to people in the audience. Marmaduke Cooper may have been there. And he starts saying, you own slaves, you have blood on your hands. You own slaves, you have blood on your hands. And he pulls out the sword, he stabs the book. Poke juiceberry, which everyone believes is blood, and they believe it's the Bible, is squirting all over the people in the front rows. People are freaking out, screaming and yelling. He obviously made his point. And people get so angry, the men come up, they grab him, and they literally toss him out the door, but he lays there in the threshold until the meeting is over, forcing everyone to literally step over him as they leave, and he continues to berate them. Well, just to give you another idea, another stunt that he pulled, if we can call it a stunt, he kidnapped some Quaker children at one point in his life, brought them back to his cave. Obviously, they were recovered, but his point was, imagine how a Black African mother and father feel when you steal their children and sell them away. How did it feel? So you get the impression that, you get the picture. This guy was out there in how he presented his ideas. Let's draw a contrast with this man, John Woolman, born in Mount Holly. John Woolman, completely different approach. One of love, not anger. He is so pious and fervent in his belief that this quote, the practice of slave keeping is inconsistent with Christian religion. At the age of 21, he said that to his boss. He was a tradesman. He was working for a shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper owned a slave. And he was going to sell that slave to another Quaker. And he asked John Woolman to write up a bill of sale, which John Woolman did. But this ate at his soul, that he was literally having a hand in selling another human being. So he did it, but then he said to his boss, and the Quaker, who was probably a very well-known person and wealthy, says to them, like, I'm never doing this again. And I think what you're doing is inconsistent with being a Christian. And from then on, he began to speak quietly and live a life that demonstrated that accepting all human beings as human beings was key to humanity. He would travel to the South. He would travel to North or East Jersey. And eventually he would go to England. I'm sorry, let's back up, 1558. His impact is that he would, by 1758, influence the Quaker congregation to disavow owning slaves. And by the early 1770s, it was adopted that that was no longer part of being a Quaker. That if you owned slaves, you were basically asked to leave the congregation. So I would assume, I believe Marmaduke Cooper left, as many wealthy Quakers did. He travels in 1772 to England, preaches there, and unfortunately dies of smallpox. But his influence is the Anti-Slavery Society forms in England and in in the colonies, 1776, and Ben Franklin will become one of its presidents. So I jumped ahead. So there's his major impact, 1758 and in 1776, the two key ideas of his real impact. And then, well, where it goes next is what is interesting. So census in 1745 shows that 74% of the enslaved people, basically most of the people in that are free will eventually be in West Jersey. Now, at the same time, 1758, as you recall from last week, Brotherton becomes the first Native American reservation. The native Lenape's population had really diminished so incredibly much that they were pretty much, their land holdings had been reduced quite a bit to just being the Pine Barrens. They realized that they needed some very specific land. So through John Brainerd, they were able to get 3,000 acres, which today is Indian Mills, which John Brainerd helped them start the sawmill and the grist mill there. Things did not go well for them, and by 1802, the remaining few go to New York to live with a related tribe and eventually Oklahoma. But in southern New Jersey, West Jersey, there are still Lenape descendants who have remained. So this takes us to the period of industrialization in the Pines. We're looking at Atzine Lake. Running left and right is Route 206. That's Atzine Road running along Atzine Lake, and then Quaker Bridge Road. It's a human-made lake, and it was made to start the iron industry. The iron industry is going to bring industrialization into the area, and this is not far from where the Still family would first live. So in 1804, New Jersey agrees upon what is called gradual manumission. And so if a child was born after July 4th, 1804, within 25 years for males and 21 years for females, they would be free. So by 1830, there are going to be free Black communities in West Jersey, most notable one named Timbuktu, which will flourish and become a station on the Underground Railroad. So this takes us to our story of Levin and Sidney Steele in Maryland. So they're slaves, they're married, but they're on different plantations in different counties, Eastern Shore of Maryland. And Levin manages to buy his freedom. Now, the way this came about was that, as many of you know, the master's children, when they were very young, there really were no other playmates except the slaves. So Levin grew up with the master's son, and they probably hunted, fished, played together, swam. They got to know one another. Perhaps they were even friends. Well, when his owner, the father, he died, and when the master's son was a teenager, and since Levin was close to this guy, he said to him, like, please allow me to buy my freedom, because I can't stand the yoke of slavery for my whole life. And this guy said yes. So he allowed Levin to earn enough money to buy his freedom. So he's free, But Sydney's on a different plantation, and they have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Even after Levin buys his freedom, he lives in the area for 7 years. Then he leaves for Greenwich, New Jersey, across the Delaware Bay in West Jersey. They made a plan. Sydney escapes with all 4 children, successfully getting to Greenwich, New Jersey. Now, they reunite there, but unfortunately, the slave catchers get them, return her and the 4 children to the plantation in Eastern Shore, Maryland. And they keep her in an attic for a month to get the running spirit out of her. Well, that spirit did not leave. And once she was back out of the attic, back in her cabin, she makes a new plan. But she realizes how difficult it is to do this again with 4 children. Now, her 2 boys are Levin and Peter, or Peter and Levin. They're young, I believe 8 and 6. And she figures, all right, they can probably make it. She knows what's going to happen to her 2 girls. They're going to be raped. So she leaves the 2 boys with her mother, and she escapes again with her 2 girls. And so her second attempt with the girls is successful. So this is 1805, and she escapes again from Talbot County, changes her name to Charity. And she and her husband have made a plan to meet in, basically it's Evesham Township. It will become Chemung Township. And they changed their name from Steele to Still. And they're going to have 14 more children. But if you've ever seen the film or read the book, Sophie's Choice, that's the kind of choice that Charity or Sydney Still had to make. That she was letting her 2 children go, and little she didn't know, but in retribution, the master sold her 2 boys to, and they ended up in Kentucky. So this is about the same time Underground Railroad is beginning to form. So their escape predates the Underground Railroad, and which runs through West Jersey. And so this is beginning to move through West Jersey. And yes, this technically is the first international human rights movement. And look at the roots of the Underground Railroad right through West Jersey. You've got Greenwich, you've got Salem. There's a great museum in Salem from 2 sisters who set up a station there. And of course, you have Evesham, Mount Holly. Mount Holly would be Timbuktu. And initially, the idea was to get people to just into the north, but eventually out to Perth Amboy, because we'll see how things will change by 1850. Sydney and or Charity and Levin's firstborn child is James. And James, they're living in Chemung Township, and at an early age of 4, he has an inspiration after being inoculated for smallpox. So a doctor from the Philadelphia area is coming through the area, inoculating people with smallpox. And he is so enamored with this that he gets pine needles and practices, pretends he's giving inoculations to his brothers and sisters. So I'd like to read, this is his autobiographical book, The Early Recollections. And I'd just like to read a quick excerpt of this inspiration that he had at such a young age. He's referring to the inoculations that he just had. Looking forward to the time. So in the yard and looking forward to the time when I too should be like Dr. Fort, riding around, healing the sick and doing great miracles. These thoughts would come over me with an enrapturing sense. So at age 4, he had this idea, this inspiration to be a doctor. Well, as he becomes 18, 19, 20, he works for a man for 3 years. And part of the deal is that every January, he's going to get a month of education. So he gets 3 months education, learns how to read, write, and cipher, do arithmetic. And he grew up, it was hard work. I mean, he grows up digging marl, felling trees, grubbing roots. And when he's 21, he fills his contract with that man. He gets $10, new suit of clothes, and he moves to Philadelphia, where he works in a glue factory. This is when they actually used horses to turn them into glue. Nasty, nasty work, but he proves his worth. He becomes a foreman. Of course, his boss is a Quaker, and he starts saving money. Now, he doesn't give up his dream about becoming a doctor, but he's in his 20s living in Philly. So, as I pointed out, his life story is shown in this book called Early Recollections in the Life of James, Dr. James Still. So, I'd like to read for you. In Philadelphia, he gets a bit of encouragement. So he's saving some money, still wants to become a doctor. And quick excerpt, page 72, chapter 7. As a young man, he's looking for a book on botany. And he writes, the idea had struck me to get a medical botany book to instruct me in the knowledge of plants. I went up to Chestnut Street, to where I've never known since, and saw a large bookstore on the corner. Entering, I asked the man behind the counter if he had a medical botany book. He looked at me and answered in the negative. There was an old gentleman in the store who noticed me and said, "Has thee a notion of studying medical botany?" I answered yes. "Then," he said, "thee must never give up." The old gentleman was dressed in Quaker garb and said to the storekeeper, "Can't thee tell him where to get one?" The man hesitated for a moment and said, "Perhaps you can get one on the corner of 8th or 9th at a bookstand." The Quaker-looking gentleman seemed to be quite interested and asked me my name and where I lived, and told me I could get somewhere, that I could get one somewhere, and I must not give it up. His way and his manner startled me. And I wondered to myself if he saw anything in me that I was keeping secret. He bade me farewell, hoping I would be successful. I left and have never seen the store or the man since. Well, he was successful, and he found medical botany books. And I like to point out this part of the story because sometimes just a kind word and encouragement is what young people need to keep going on a path. And using those medical and botany books, James begins to experiment and develop medicines and a very successful practice. Now, one of his first medicines was a cough balsam, and that cough balsam is going to be sold by 2 Quaker pharmacists in Philadelphia. He starts making some serious money. He moves back to Chemung, utilizing the Pine Barrens as his place to gather plants, and marries and becomes very successful, eventually building a big, beautiful home in Medford. He travels about, he gets a horse and buggy, and he begins to treat not only African-American families, but also local white families. So to give an example of how his success grows, Another example, page 78. About the year 1845, my mother came to my house telling me about John Naylor's daughter, who was seriously affected with scrofula, a skin condition that had been since she was 1 year old. I said to my mother to tell Mr. Naylor to bring his daughter down to get a place for her to board near me, and I would cure her. And this is a white woman. After a little time, he got board for her at Abram Carlson's. He told me that the doctor said she could not be cured and that they had refused to do anything for her. She was, in reality, the most distressing case I had ever seen. Her neck and breasts were ulcerated and so swollen and sore that she could not raise her hands to her head. Her presence was offensive, and it was not pleasant to be in the room with her. In 2 weeks from the time I began treatment of her case, the child could comb her hair, of which fact she was very proud. Whilst I was treating her, I would often call persons in to see her. To some, she was just too unpleasant. To others, to look at. Others exclaimed, "Jim Still, if you can cure her, you can do anything." And I continued on, and she eventually was able to return home cured. He has a variety of stories where other white doctors were declaring people having cancer and then having no hope, him coming in to help them. Now, if you think at the times, he was probably doing all the right things. He was more of a holistic healer, a herbalist. The white doctors at the times were using mercury, which we know kills people. They were using bloodletting, which weakens someone. And they were doing surgeries without sterilizing any of their instruments, which kills people. So his track record was really pretty good, and his reputation built that he was quite busy all the time and became incredibly successful. Well, another picture of Dr. Still's residence in Medford. His youngest brother, William, gets a better education, and he moves to Philly and becomes a clerk for the Anti-Slavery Society. And within a year, William Still becomes a trusted member of the Anti-Slavery Society. He and his wife, their home becomes a station on the Underground Railroad. He edits the newspaper and delivers it for the group, and he becomes an integral part of the Underground Railroad. So one day, 1850, William has two men come into his office and with a story. So I'm going to read. So this book is called William Still, His Life and Work to This Time by James Boyd. And it's 1850. William Still has been working for quite a while now with the Underground Railroad. And one day, a local man brings in a former slave from Alabama who comes and says, "I'm from Alabama. I've come in search of my people. I and my little brother were kidnapped over about 40 years ago. And I thought about coming to Philadelphia and having notices written and perhaps placed in your issue of Pennsylvania Freeman." So William's listening to this guy and he starts questioning him. And he says, "What's your name?" He says, "Peter." He asks, "What was your little brother's name?" "Levin." "What were the names of your mother and father?" "Mother's name was Sidney and father's name was Levin." By this time, this is William speaking, I was simply thunderstruck, so to speak. I had to summon all my powers of control in the presence of the stranger. So fully was I convinced by this time that he was one of my long lost brothers. I allowed a full hour to pass, meanwhile plying him with 1,000 questions touching upon his entire life. Then seated myself by his side, I said, I think I can tell you about your kinfolk, mother, father, etc. You are my own brother. William is able to take his brother Peter to meet his sisters and be reunited with his mother. Peter will go on to write a book called The Kidnapped and the Ransomed. And so if you can get this book, there's his story. Of course, the beginning has changed a little bit because they were runaway slaves in West Jersey. So they changed the beginning a little bit, but he tells his story about what happens from Kentucky on. His brother had died in the meantime. So we're going to come back to Peter for part 2. So when Peter tells William this still, we're going to go back to William for a second. William realizes that every runaway slave coming through my office probably has a story like my brother's. He starts to write them down. And every runaway slave that comes through, he questions them, where they lived, who their masters were, what conditions were like, anything he can get. And he's writing this journal. Well, this is very dangerous and against the law keeping, very dangerous to be keeping these kinds of records. He keeps these records in a coffin in a graveyard run by a Quaker. He's going to do this for 10 years. This work will eventually become the Underground Railroad records. So he starts keeping those records. And one of the stories he tells is a story of Henry Box Brown. Some of you may know this story. In Virginia, this young man, Henry Brown, was a slave, and he knew a Quaker carpenter, and they devised this plan to build a box with one air hole. Right on the lid, William Still's address, and within 48 hours, I think, 72 hours, it's sent and it's delivered to William Still in Philadelphia. He's prying the lid off this thing. He has no idea what's in it. And out pops Henry Box Brown. Great story. Henry Box Brown goes on to do shows where he basically is making money with the box and telling his story. Another great story that William Still writes is about Jane Johnson. This is happening in Philadelphia. So Philadelphia, since the formation of the United States, Pennsylvania law stated that any slave living in Pennsylvania would be free after 6 months, which George Washington knew, which is why George Washington was rotating his slaves out of his Philadelphia office, where the capital was at that time, so that he didn't have to lose his slaves. 2 of his slaves at least ran away to New England, which he never was able to recover. But anyway, another aspect of the Pennsylvania law was that if a slave owner knowingly brought a slave into Pennsylvania, all that slave had to do was say, I want to be free. Now, the story of Jane Johnson is this. She and her 2 sons were brought to Philadelphia by a very wealthy and well-connected man who was an ambassador for the United States to, I believe, Nicaragua. And he was on his way to New York, but he had to stop and do some business in Philadelphia. And he knew the law. And he was keeping a close eye on Jane Johnson so that she wouldn't do anything. Well, she manages to scribble a note to a Black worker in the hotel who delivers it to William Still and says, come down to the wharf. There's a woman who wants to claim her freedom. Go down to the wharf as quickly as possible, get on the ship, find Jane Johnson and say to her, so William and another couple other guys go down there and say, hey, if you want to be free, all you have to do is say it, and this man can't stop you. And of course, he's trying to intimidate, the slave master is trying to intimidate him. And she states very loudly that she wants to be free and she wants her boys to be free. And they walk off the boat, as you can see in the picture there, and they escape. Well, this man, the slave owner, brings a lawsuit against William Still and the other gentlemen, the Quakers who are helping him. And this is big news. The trial is set, and he's saying that they kidnapped her. Well, when this trial starts, Jane Johnson shows up and testifies and says, no. I clearly stated that I wanted to be free, and end of story. She was free, her children were free, and the slave owner lost that case. So just two quick examples of William Still's work as Underground Railroad station master. Now, Peter Still's story, part 2. As I said, Peter had escaped. Part of his story was the fact that he was married and he had 2 children still in Alabama. And when his story was published, one day a Quaker man named Seth Conklin came to him and said, I want to go to Alabama and rescue your family. And everyone's like, you're crazy. You're going to go to the deep South and try to get these folks and bring them back? He's like, yeah, I know it's dangerous, but I'm going to do it. Well, Seth Conklin did it. Came up with some ruse. He travels down there, gets Peter Still's wife and children, brings them back to Indiana. Unfortunately, is caught by slave catchers. Seth Conklin is murdered, and they take Peter Still's family back. Well, this is heartbreaking for Peter, who certainly wants to be reunited with his family. So I'm going to read another excerpt from Dr. Still's book that tells the rest of the story of Peter. Peter served in slavery for 45 years, and by saving in industry was able to buy his freedom of his master whilst living in Alabama. And he goes on and tells the story of Seth Conklin. Upon hearing the news that Seth Conklin had been murdered and his family taken back into bondage, Peter was nearly heartbroken. He next purposed to collect money to purchase his wife and children. After traveling about for 5 years, he gathered the sum of $5,000, with which he bought them. They were delivered to him in 1855, the wife, 2 sons, and a daughter. They arrived at my house on January 13th of that year, and after showing his family to anxious friends who were interested, Peter settled down in Burlington, New Jersey. There he purchased a small truck farm of 10 acres and had a house and other buildings erected thereon. He commenced farming and trucking, selling his produce in the town, where he was patronized by many of the best families who sympathized with him on account of his past condition, and was thus enabled to provide a living for himself and his family. He left his property to his wife during his life, and at her death passed to a son and daughter. So amazing family, amazing story, not finished. William Still will go on after the Civil War. Obviously no need for an anti-slavery society anymore, Underground Railroad. So as they're disbanding, everyone in the society knew that he had been keeping these records. So he suggested, like, they said to him, like, why don't you publish this? And it takes him years, but in 1872, William Still publishes the Underground Railroad records. This is how we know so much about the Underground Railroad. And he is dubbed at the time as the father of the Underground Railroad. So it's a fascinating story about a fascinating family that could only happen in West Jersey. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit the Dr. James Still Education Center in Medford, New Jersey. The docents there have put together a exact replica of Henry Box Brown's box. So you can imagine, like, you can see it, how big it was and how he lived in it for a couple days. You can see some of the medicines and other materials and things that the doctor Still probably used. So quickly, just going to show some of the plants from the Pine Barrens that have been used by herbalists and possibly used by Dr. Still, and provide some of their uses. So this is one many of you know, tea berry. It's beginning to, it'll be turning red in the next few months, and late fall, early winter is when you can get it. And obviously it has a variety of uses here, and high in vitamin C. Many of you know striped wintergreen, and you can see that it has many uses. Reindeer lichen. There are many different lichens in the Pine Barrens, and this has a variety of them, especially as teas. Shield lichens. You gargle it for sore throats. Don't drink it. Many of you know this story. Sphagnum moss, which is found in all the Atlantic white cedar swamps, essentially helps form the habitat for the Atlantic white cedar. The sphagnum mosses that are there, like huge sponges, sucking up water and holding on to the water to be released later. It's great for maintaining, to stop flooding. Well, what we can't see living among sphagnum moss is a bacterium that produces an antiseptic quality liquid waste product that's in the sphagnum. And during World War II, this was used as a wound dressing. Now, this was probably used by the Lenape and then learned how it could be used by the colonists and then the Quakers and then probably Dr. Still. Many of you know Drosera. We have round-leafed, we have thread-leafed, and we have spatulated leafed. I'm sure it would take a while to gather enough of the sticky fluids for these purposes. And of course, everyone knows about cranberries and blueberries, high in vitamin C. Sassafras was actually one of the exports from the colonies. It was considered a cure-all, variety of things. And Dr. Still references it in his book of how he was using it for a variety of things, including piles. Sassafras oil, as many of you know, and then root beer. So sassafras is one of those great plants that one of its unusual characteristics has 4 different shaped leaves. It has single leaf, mittens, left and right, and then threes. Bayberry, many are familiar with this, probably more as for bayberry candles. Sweet fern, I've actually used this for poison ivy. Smells great, and as you can see, a variety of treatments. Probably the most beautiful fragrance to be found in the Pine Barren swamps in May and June, swamp magnolia. This is one of those northern plants that was pushed down into the Pine Barrens by glaciers and is very common in bogs, lakes, rivers, along with white water lilies. So if you have any questions, please call And there's the number and the meeting ID. And I guess, all right, 10:55. We did okay time-wise. And I guess if Joel's going to come on and say hello.
John, thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting program. I really enjoyed it. It was great to hear the history of the family. A remarkable story, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us today.
You're welcome. I hope folks enjoyed it. Just a fascinating family, part of our Pine Barrens history, and part of the West Jersey history, because hopefully people see all those connections. To just say that the Still family started living here in 1805, you really have to have that backstory about how that was possible. That so many free African Americans were living in West Jersey. So here's just a quick map I have, even just from where you're sitting. The dark area shows the incredible number of free Blacks living in West Jersey. So we really have a great heritage of tolerance and recognition of human rights in West Jersey. Big contrast with what I like to call North Jersey, but East Jersey, there's some pretty horrible things that were happening to slaves. There were lynchings in East Jersey at various times. Not a good history at all, but not in West Jersey. So there's really something special about our cultural heritage here, and that's what the Friends of the Black Run are trying to celebrate and educate people about the unique background of this area, starting with the Lenni Lenape. And the Lenni Lenape are the original people going back to the Paleo natives. So you could say this land is very special in that no war between native cultures and European cultures. Of course, Civil War, and New Jersey's had Revolutionary War, more Revolutionary War battles fought in New Jersey than any other state. So there was a lot of activity out here, including the Pine Barrens, which is more in Joel's neck of the woods with Chestnut's Neck, or what became Port Republic. So, all right, so if we have any questions, comments, I guess, so Joel, we'll just hang in there and wait and see if anyone has any.
Yep, exactly. We'll hang here for a few minutes and see if any folks would like to call in with a question. I did notice there was a number of people and are watching the program live. So like John said, if you got a question, there's the phone number. Please call in and use the meeting ID, and I can put you through, and we can ask John any questions we have. What a neat melting pot the Pinelands is in so many ways, with the stories you said today, and then also some of the other, multiple different ethnic groups that have moved into the Pinelands at different times. Russians, some Jewish folks, definitely some of the Germans associated with the glass industry, and it really is a very good, uniquely diverse area with all the different folks that ended up here, as time went on.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention, in 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, this now allowed slave catchers to go into the northern states, and people were breaking the law if they didn't give up slaves or give information. So the Underground Railroad really had to shift their approach, and that's when they started getting people all the way up into Canada. So there were communities in Canada that began to evolve with large former slaves going there. And of course, there was fake news that these former slaves living in Canada were causing all sorts of problems and how terrible it was. And at one point, William and his brother James traveled to these communities in Canada to investigate. And of course, they were totally bogus, and people were getting along incredibly well. And those free African Americans were thriving. And James even writes about that in his book, how he went to William writes about it in his book, that he takes his brother and they go to Canada. Yeah, page 61. Yeah, it's just, he lists a bunch of the fake news, and then he and his brother go up there. And of course, he wanted his brother to be there to, administer to people as a doctor, but also to show folks like, look, here's a Black man who is a wealthy doctor. He has been able to really utilize all his talents and skills, and hopefully inspire other people to use their talents and skills too. So just so many different levels and layers to the story. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, and it's so neat. It really says if you have the gumption and you want to work hard, you can make almost anything happen. And the Still family is absolutely a great example of that perseverance and that willingness to do what it takes to make your dreams come true.
Yeah, but there also has to, having talent and the gumption to do it, but there has to be opportunity. There has to be acceptance. There has to be, there can't be systematic racism that's going to limit you from what you can become. And unfortunately, that will evolve after the Civil War, late 1800s, early 1900s, which really was the eugenics program, which was a way of getting people to think that certain people were inferior and others were not. And we're able to continue building upon building racism based upon false information. Eugenics is a pseudoscience. And unfortunately, we're still living with it today. I mean, it's obviously what drives a lot of the racism we see today. It's just disheartening.
Yeah, that's a great point. There, like you said, there really does have to be, the opportunity has to be there, and we can definitely say for sure that the opportunity hasn't always been there, particularly in our country.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the sad part is, eugenics theory is just so deeply ingrained, largely through education. I mean, it was basically being taught through the 1950s. And this has just enabled people to limit opportunity for people because they, are considered inferior and not worthy and even not human. And it's just crazy. There's only one human species. We're it.
Yep.
And unless we evolve socially and learn to get along, we're not going to be able to pull it off and try and share this planet in peace.
Yep.
And I think that's what most people want.
Yeah, I was, thinking the other day, I was out in the woods doing some work, and my mind was kind of going, and I was thinking about manifest destiny and the whole concept that, we were here for this reason to, develop and to spread across the United States, and we were destined to do that. And how growing up, that was something that you were taught as, yep, this is what it was. And, it's just such a bogus way to explain the, changing of the landscape and moving the native peoples. And I just, that's exactly what you're talking about, that concept. But it absolutely was part of education. That's what you were taught, and still to some degree taught today. About how we expanded westward.
Yeah, and destroying the native cultures. The eugenics thing is, the primitive cultures were that were more superior culture as opposed to these primitive cultures who were living in harmony with nature. These matriarchal societies, which everyone was being taken care of. The Lenni Lenape women were in charge of food production, food distribution. There was no, if there was hunger, everybody was hungry. Everyone was taken care of when there was good times. And if there were bad times, everyone was being affected equally across the board. So we call these, these societies that get pushed to the side as if they were unimportant, when really there were so many positive things that we could perhaps learn from these cultures, instead of putting them in little boxes of saying they're primitive as opposed to, advanced.
Yeah, the idea that no one owns the land and we're all part of the land. I mean, those things I think about all the time is that absolutely, probably the way it should be, as opposed to this is mine and you can have it, which is really a backwards way to think about it, especially looking at the past and how people at one time really looked at the resources as everybody's.
Yeah, and we have so much open space, recreation areas, national parks, local parks, state parks. This is all open space. This is all public land, and trying to get the diversity of our country out, enjoying it and respecting one another's right to be there, and trying to leave no trace, take care of the land, but share the land. And that's really what the native philosophy was. It doesn't really it belongs to everybody. Unfortunately, many times what we have happening in places like the Black Run Preserve, what is known as the tragedy of the commons, that some people go out, and they just, it's all about them. And they'll trash it, or they'll graffiti, or they'll play loud music. And, people are like, came here for some peace and quiet. You got the boom box going. It's just, it could be bring so much positive into the world if we utilized our open spaces, made them more accessible to everyone, and encouraged more people to learn about them and to utilize them for outdoor recreation education. This is how we can improve public health. I mean, this pandemic has certainly made it evident that people need and want the outdoors to be available to them for outdoor recreation.
All right, John. Well, we've been hanging out here for a little while. I really want to thank you for taking the time to share both of your presentations with us, the last week and this week.
You're welcome, Joel.
You really enriched our audience and provided some really, really good insight into our history, our ecology, and just life in general. So I really appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone who joined us, and let's all stay positive. Take care.
All right, that's a great note to end it on. And like John said, let's keep it positive. With that, I'm going to sign off, and we'll see you again next week. We have a program coming up next week on the health benefits of cranberries and blueberries, and we're looking forward to that as well. So have a good weekend, and we'll see you all next week.
Excellent. All right. Thanks.